A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, there is a fundamental paradox at the heart of the free market that has always fascinated me. We celebrate the successful entrepreneur who builds a better mousetrap, gains market share, and eventually dominates their field. But the moment that company becomes truly successful, its natural instinct is often to pull up the ladder behind it and dismantle the very competitive mechanisms that allowed it to rise in the first place. It is like the immune system of capitalism is constantly fighting against the very cells it is supposed to protect.
That is a brilliant way to frame it, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, our housemate Daniel really hit on a massive topic with this prompt today. We are diving deep into the world of antitrust regulation and market competition. It is a subject that people often think is just about dry legal filings or the price of a gallon of milk, but it is actually about the structural integrity of our entire economic life. Especially now, in March of 2026, where digital platforms hold more power than some nation-states, antitrust has become the primary ideological fault line between those who believe in pure market autonomy and those who think the state needs to step in to keep the game fair.
And I think we need to start by looking at what antitrust actually is. At its core, it is the legal boundary between what we call a competitive advantage and what the law calls market foreclosure. It is the difference between winning a race because you are the fastest runner and winning because you tripped everyone else at the starting line. Today, that line is blurrier than ever because the track itself is often owned by one of the runners.
It really is. And to understand how we got here, we have to look back at the late 19th century. Most people have heard of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, but they might not realize how momentous it was. It passed the United States Senate with a vote of 51-1. That kind of consensus is almost unheard of today. Back then, the concern was the great trusts, like Standard Oil and the railroad monopolies. People were terrified that these massive entities were becoming more powerful than the government itself. They were not just economic actors, they were political ones.
Right, but the goal back then was a bit different from how we think of it now. In those early days, the focus was often on protecting competitors, making sure there was room for the small business owner to exist. The idea was that a healthy democracy required a decentralized economy, but that changed significantly in the 1970s and 80s, largely due to the influence of thinkers like Robert Bork and the broader Chicago School of Economics. We talked about this shift in episode 858 when we covered the rise of neoliberalism. Bork popularized what we call the consumer welfare standard.
Oh, the Bork Revolution. That is where the modern era of antitrust really began. Bork argued in his seminal book, The Antitrust Paradox, that the only thing the law should care about is whether a merger or a business practice hurts consumers, usually measured by higher prices or reduced output. If a company gets huge but keeps prices low through efficiency, Bork said the government should leave it alone. He viewed bigness as a sign of success and efficiency, not a crime. This philosophy has dominated the American legal system for over 40 years, and it fundamentally narrowed the scope of what the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission would actually prosecute.
It is a very clean, logical framework, but as we are seeing with the rise of the digital economy, it might be too narrow for the 21st century. When you have products that are free to the consumer, like search engines or social media, the price is zero. Under a strict consumer welfare standard, how do you even prove harm? If the price stays at zero, is there no antitrust violation? That is the puzzle we are trying to solve right now. It turns out that when the product is free, you might be the product, and the harm might be to privacy, innovation, or the quality of information, rather than your wallet.
And that brings us to the actual economic rationale for why a government would ever want to intervene in a market. In a perfect world, competition is self-sustaining. But in the real world, we deal with things like network effects and high switching costs. These are the gravity wells of the digital age.
Let us break those down, because they are the engines of modern monopolies. Network effects, or what some call Metcalfe's law, basically mean that a service becomes more valuable as more people use it. A telephone is useless if you are the only person who has one. If everyone is on one social media platform, that platform becomes infinitely more valuable than a competitor with only 10 users, even if the competitor has better features. This creates a winner. Take-all dynamic where the first mover to reach critical mass becomes almost impossible to dislodge.
Right. And once you are in that network, the switching costs are what keep you there. It is not just about the money. It is the friction of moving your data, your contacts, your photos, or learning an entirely new interface. When the cost of leaving a service is high enough, the company providing that service no longer has to compete on quality. They can start acting like a gatekeeper. They can raise prices for advertisers, squeeze suppliers, or degrade the user experience because they know you are unlikely to leave.
This is where the debate gets really heated, especially when you look at it through the lens of different economic schools of thought. I want to spend some time on the Austrian and libertarian perspective here, because it is often the most rigorous critique of antitrust enforcement. Thinkers like Joseph Schumpeter and Friedrich Hayek had a very different view of what a monopoly actually is. They did not see it as a static problem to be solved by a judge.
They did not. The Austrian view is built on the idea of Schumpeterian creative destruction. They argue that what looks like a monopoly is usually just a temporary reward for a massive leap in innovation. If a company dominates a market, it is because they offered something so much better than everyone else that the market chose them. And according to this view, the market is much better at correcting itself than the government is. They would say that the high profits of a monopoly are actually a giant neon sign telling other entrepreneurs, come and disrupt this.
The argument is that if a monopoly starts overcharging or becomes stagnant, that creates a massive profit incentive for a new entrepreneur to come in and disrupt them with an entirely new technology. Think about how the dominance of the mainframe computer was disrupted not by a government lawsuit, but by the invention of the personal computer, or how Sears was disrupted by Walmart, which was then disrupted by Amazon. The Austrians believe that the state lacks the knowledge to intervene correctly. Hayek called this the knowledge problem. No central planner can possibly understand the trillions of individual preferences that make a market work.
And the Austrian critique goes even deeper. They argue that state intervention often causes more harm than the perceived monopoly ever could. One of the biggest concepts here is regulatory capture. This is the idea that when you create a powerful regulatory agency to oversee an industry, the biggest companies in that industry will eventually use their resources to influence that agency. They hire the former regulators, they lobby the politicians, and they eventually turn the law into a weapon against their own competitors.
It is the ultimate irony. A big company will actually lobby for more regulation because they have the legal teams and the capital to comply with it, while their smaller, hungrier competitors are crushed by the red tape. In that sense, the government is not breaking up the monopoly, it is actually building a moat around it. The Austrian argument is basically, the only true permanent monopolies are the ones created or protected by the state through licensing, patents, or subsidies. Without government interference, a monopoly is just a target for the next innovator.
I find that perspective very compelling because it respects the dynamic nature of the economy. But we have to look at the historical benchmarks to see if it holds up. Take the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911. That is the gold standard for antitrust. Standard Oil controlled 90% of the oil refining in the United States. The Supreme Court ordered it broken into 34 different companies.
And the results were fascinating. Many of those successor companies became the giants we know today, like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. The competition between those companies actually led to more innovation in refining and distribution. But here is the kicker: John Rockefeller actually became much wealthier after the breakup because the individual parts were worth more than the whole. It showed that the monopoly was actually suppressing the value of its own components by being too bureaucratic and focused on maintaining control.
That is a great point. But now compare that to the current scrutiny of cloud infrastructure providers. Today, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud control the vast majority of the world's computing power. They are the new utilities. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission are looking at whether these companies use their dominance in cloud to give their own software products an unfair advantage. It is the same logic as Standard Oil, but the infrastructure is digital. If you own the cloud, you can see what every other business is doing, and you could potentially copy their most successful features or make their apps run slower on your servers.
That brings us to the other side of the fence. If the Austrians are the skeptics of antitrust, who are the proponents? We have seen a real resurgence in what people are calling the new Brandeisian movement, named after Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. This movement is often associated with people like Lena Khan, the current chair of the Federal Trade Commission.
This group argues that the consumer welfare standard is a failure because it ignores the political and social costs of concentrated power. They believe that when a few companies control the flow of information, the terms of commerce, and the livelihoods of millions of workers, it is a threat to democracy itself. It is not just about whether the price of a widget went down by 5 cents. It is about who has the power to decide which widgets get sold in the first place. They want to return to the original intent of the Sherman Act, which was to prevent any private entity from becoming more powerful than the public interest.
It is a very different philosophical starting point. It moves antitrust away from pure technocratic economics and back into the realm of political economy. You also have the European tradition, which is quite distinct from the American one. They call it ordoliberalism. It originated in Germany after World War II, and it has a massive influence on how the European Union handles competition today.
Ordoliberalism is fascinating. The idea there is that the market is not a naturally occurring state of nature that we should just leave alone. Instead, the market is a social construct that requires a strong legal framework to function. The state's job is to ensure the structure of the market remains competitive. They do not just care about consumer prices, they care about the freedom of small and medium-sized enterprises to compete. They are much more willing to intervene proactively to prevent a company from becoming a gatekeeper.
And you can see that in the way the European Union has been acting lately. They passed the Digital Markets Act, or the DMA, which fully went into effect in 2024. It is what we call ex-ante regulation. Instead of waiting for a company to do something bad and then suing them, which can take a decade in court, the law sets out a list of do's and don'ts for these big gatekeeper platforms ahead of time. For example, they cannot favor their own services over those of rivals on their platforms.
It is a much more aggressive approach. In the United States, we tend to be reactive. We wait for the harm to happen, then we have a massive trial like the ones we have seen against Google and Apple recently. But in the time it takes to finish a trial, the entire industry might have moved on. The European approach says, we know these companies are gatekeepers, so we are going to limit what they can do right now to ensure smaller players have a chance to breathe. It is about preserving the structure of the market, not just fixing a specific bad behavior.
But this leads us directly into one of the most difficult tensions in modern policy, which is the conflict between antitrust and industrial policy. This is the national champion dilemma. On one hand, you want a competitive domestic market. You want 5 different companies competing to build the best AI or the best cloud infrastructure. But on the other hand, you are looking at the global map and seeing state-subsidized giants from China that are operating with the full backing of their government.
This is a massive headache for policymakers in Washington. If the United States Department of Justice decides to break up one of our big tech companies, are we just kneecapping our own team in a global competition? If we make it harder for our companies to achieve massive scale, do we lose the ability to compete with a Chinese company that is being given billions of dollars in subsidies and has no antitrust restrictions at all? We saw this tension with the CHIPS Act, where the government is handing out billions to build domestic semiconductor capacity. That is industrial policy, and it often favors the biggest players who have the scale to build these massive factories.
Right. It is a classic trade-off. Do you prioritize domestic competition or international strength? We saw this back in the 1980s with the breakup of AT&T. There were people then who argued that breaking up the Bell system would destroy America's lead in telecommunications research, especially at Bell Labs. It turned out that the breakup actually unleashed a wave of innovation that led to the modern internet. But the risk was real. Today, the stakes feel even higher with the race for artificial intelligence.
And it is not just about breaking them up. It is about how other policies either reinforce or undermine competition. Think about tax policy. We give massive research and development credits that often favor the biggest players because they have the largest R&D budgets and the best accountants to claim them. Or think about trade policy, where regulations might be written in a way that only the biggest exporters can navigate. You can have a very aggressive antitrust division at the Department of Justice, but if the Treasury Department is handing out subsidies to the incumbents, you are basically rowing the boat in two different directions at once.
Governments are constantly trying to reconcile these things. Sometimes they use what they call competition advocacy, where the antitrust authorities actually weigh in on other government regulations to point out how they might be hurting competition. But it is an uphill battle. For our listeners who are navigating their own industries, there are some really practical ways to look at this. One of the most important things is to be able to distinguish between a natural monopoly and an artificial one.
That is a crucial distinction. A natural monopoly happens when the infrastructure required to serve a market is so expensive that it only makes sense for one company to do it. Think of water pipes or power lines. You do not want 5 different companies digging up your street to lay 5 different sets of water pipes. In those cases, we usually accept the monopoly but regulate it heavily as a public utility. But an artificial monopoly is different. That is when a company uses tactics like predatory pricing, exclusive dealing, or tying their products together to kill off competition.
If you are a business owner, you need to be watching for these things. Are you being forced to use a specific payment processor just because you use a certain platform? Are you being prevented from selling your products on other sites? Those are the red flags of market foreclosure. Another huge thing to watch is interoperability. We talked about this in episode 1239 when we discussed technical standards. Interoperability is often the best market-based solution to a monopoly.
It really is. If the law requires that different platforms can talk to each other, it lowers the switching costs for the consumer. Imagine if you could send a message from one social media app to another, just like you can send an email from a Gmail account to an Outlook account. If we had that kind of interoperability across the digital economy, the network effects of the big players would not be such a massive barrier to entry. You could start a new social network, and your first 10 users could still communicate with their friends on the big platforms. It preserves the efficiency of the big network while allowing for competition at the edges.
I agree. But it also makes me wonder about the future of antitrust enforcement. We are entering the age of artificial intelligence, and that is going to change the game entirely. Imagine a world where AI models are used to monitor market prices in real time and detect collusion between companies that humans would never even notice. Or, on the flip side, imagine AI models that are so good at price optimization that they effectively collude with each other without any human ever having to pick up the phone.
That is the algorithmic collusion nightmare. If 2 different companies use the same AI software to set their prices, and those AI models both figure out that the most profitable thing to do is to keep prices high, is that a violation of antitrust law? There is no agreement between people, just 2 machines reaching the same conclusion. Our current legal framework, built on the Sherman Act of 1890, is not even close to being ready for that. We are going to need a whole new set of tools to regulate competition in an AI-driven economy.
It really makes you wonder if the invisible hand is still capable of self-correction in a world of such high-speed automated decision-making. Or has the invisible hand been permanently replaced by the visible hand of the regulator? I think it is a bit of both. We are seeing a move toward what I would call a more muscular capitalism. It is not about destroying the market. It is about recognizing that a market is like a garden. If you do not pull the weeds and make sure the big plants do not block all the sunlight, eventually nothing new can grow.
The debate is just about how much pruning is necessary and who should be holding the shears. From a conservative perspective, there is a deep skepticism of government power, and for good reason. We know that regulators are not omniscient, and that they can be just as prone to corruption and inefficiency as any corporation. But there is also a conservative tradition of being wary of any concentrated power, whether it is in the hands of a bureaucrat or a CEO. A true free market requires that no single entity is powerful enough to dictate terms to everyone else.
If a company becomes so big that it can effectively tax the rest of the economy or control the public square, that is not a free market anymore. It is a form of private central planning. And that is why this issue is so complex. It does not fit neatly into a simple left versus right box. You have people on the right who want to use antitrust to break up what they see as a biased tech monopoly, and you have people on the left who want to use it to address income inequality. It is one of the few areas where you see these strange political bedfellows emerging.
It is definitely a topic that is going to stay at the center of the national conversation for a long time. For our listeners, I think the takeaway is to stay informed about these shifts in philosophy. Whether it is the move away from the consumer welfare standard or the rise of the Digital Markets Act in Europe, these changes are going to affect everything from the apps you use to the way you run your business. Keep an eye on the interplay between these different policies. When you see a new tax credit or a new trade agreement, ask yourself, how does this affect the smaller players in the industry? Is this making the market more competitive, or is it just another brick in the moat for the incumbents?
Well said, Herman. I think we have covered a lot of ground today. From the Sherman Act of 1890 to the AI-driven markets of tomorrow, antitrust is really the story of how we try to keep the engine of capitalism running without it overheating or shaking itself apart. It is a story that is still being written, and we are all characters in it. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this deep dive. This has been a fascinating one to explore.
We love seeing the community grow. If you are finding these discussions valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation. And if you want to find more episodes or get in touch with us, head over to myweirdprompts.com. You can find our full archive there, plus the RSS feed and all the different ways to subscribe. We are also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get a notification every time a new episode drops.
We have so many more of these weird and wonderful topics to get into. Thanks to our housemate Daniel for the prompt that started this whole journey today. It is always a pleasure to dig into the mechanics of how the world actually works.
It definitely is. Until next time, I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you in the next one.
Take care, everyone.
Let us get into some of the more specific case studies before we wrap up, because I think they really illustrate the points we have been making. We mentioned Standard Oil, but think about the Microsoft case in the late 1990s. That was a huge turning point for the tech industry.
Oh, absolutely. That was the first major antitrust battle of the Internet age. The government's argument was that Microsoft was using its dominance in the operating system market to crush competition in the web browser market by bundling Internet Explorer with Windows. They were essentially using their monopoly in one area to seize a monopoly in another.
And the interesting thing there is that even though the government did not end up breaking Microsoft up, the mere fact that they were under such intense scrutiny for years arguably opened up the space for companies like Google and later Apple to thrive. It changed the culture of the industry. Microsoft became much more cautious about how they use their leverage, which created a window of opportunity for the next generation of innovators.
It is a great example of the deterrent effect of antitrust law. Sometimes it is not about the final verdict. It is about sending a signal to the entire market that there are lines you cannot cross. It forces the big players to compete on innovation rather than just on their ability to lock out competitors. We are seeing the exact same thing play out right now with the current investigations into cloud infrastructure.
The big three providers control a massive percentage of the world's computing power. If they start giving preferential treatment to their own software products on their own cloud platforms, we are right back to the same problem we had in the 90s. It is a recurring pattern. The technology changes, but the human impulse to dominate the market remains the same.
That is why we need these frameworks, whether you lean toward the Austrian view or the new Brandeisian one. We need a way to navigate the tension between the efficiency of scale and the dynamism of competition. It is a constant, evolving negotiation, and we are all part of it.
I think that is the perfect place to leave it. Thanks again for listening, everyone.
Cheers.
You know, Herman, I was just thinking about something we touched on earlier, the idea of the state being the only source of permanent monopolies. If we look at the current landscape, How much of the big tech dominance do you think is actually a result of government policy versus just pure market success?
That is a tough one, Corn. If you look at something like intellectual property law, that is a huge factor. We grant patents and copyrights to encourage innovation, which is a good thing, but those are literally state-sanctioned monopolies. If a company can build a massive patent thicket around a core technology, they can block anyone else from entering the field for decades.
Right, and that is a perfect example of how two different policy goals can clash. We want to protect the inventor, but we also want a competitive market. It is all about finding that middle ground. And then you have things like Section 230 protections in the United States, which shielded internet platforms from liability for what their users posted. That was a massive boost that allowed these companies to grow at a speed that would have been impossible if they had been treated like traditional publishers.
It is a great point. It shows that there is no such thing as a truly neutral policy. Everything the government does, from tax law to liability rules to antitrust enforcement, is shaping the structure of the market. The question is just whether we are doing it intentionally or by accident. I think we are moving toward a period where we will be much more intentional about it. The era of hands-off technocracy seems to be coming to an end.
It is a fascinating time to be watching these things. I am glad we had the chance to really pull the threads on this today.
Me too. It is a big topic, but I think we managed to hit the high points.
Definitely. All right, I think we are officially ready to sign off this time.
Sounds good.
Thanks for sticking with us through the nuances, everyone. We will be back soon with another prompt.
See you then.
Before we go, I just wanted to mention one more thing about the Austrian perspective that I find really interesting. Hayek talked about competition as a discovery procedure. He argued that we do not actually know what the best way to produce something is until we let people compete to find out.
That is such a profound idea. It means that when a regulator steps in to fix a market, they are not just stopping a monopoly, they are potentially stopping the discovery of a better way of doing things. It is a reminder to have some humility about our ability to engineer the perfect economy. The more we try to control the outcome, the more we might be stifling the very process that gives us progress.
A very conservative and very wise caution. It is the perfect note to end on.
I agree. All right, for real this time, thanks for listening to my weird prompts.
Goodbye, everyone. One last thing, Herman. I just realized we didn't mention the role of the consumer in all of this. We've been talking about regulators and CEOs, but at the end of the day, we are the ones who choose which platforms to use. Our choices are the ultimate vote in the market.
It's true. But the whole point of the antitrust argument is that sometimes those choices are an illusion because the alternatives have been systematically eliminated. Keeping the choices real is the core of the struggle.
Okay, now we are actually done.
Talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Wait, Herman. I just remembered something about the Standard Oil breakup. Did you know that the competition between the successor companies actually led to the discovery of new oil fields that Standard Oil had previously ignored?
I did. It just goes to show how unpredictable these things are. Breaking up a monopoly can unleash energy in ways that no one can predict.
It really does. Okay, now we are definitely finishing.
Agreed. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.